We want to start here with a story out of Georgia, critically important story, but it stretches all the way to the Republic of Korea, South Korea. That is the major raid which took place at a Hyundai plant in Savannah, Georgia, I believe. Man, time is flying. I think this was actually last Thursday, maybe. Man, a lot is happening very quickly. But nonetheless, it's kind of major geopolitical ructions here, a lot of issues about tariffs and things like that. To discuss all of this and more, we are very happy to be joined by Joo-hyun Park, who is a member of Notital, and I'm very happy to say the web editor at Breakthrough News. Joo-hyun, welcome back.
Eugene, Rania, good to be here as always, amongst colleagues now, I can say.
Yes. Comrades and colleagues, we're now combining things. This is fantastic. Great to have you. And big shout out to you for all the hard work you're doing to help build out the written piece of Breakthrough News. We've had a number of excellent pieces that I hope people are checking out at breakthroughnews.org. But more on that as we move forward in our weeks here. But let's now stick with what happened in Savannah last week. I think it's 316 Korean workers have now, I believe, been flown back to Korea. I mean, I guess here's the thing that is surprising to me, Joo-hyun, is, here's South Korea, which is, obviously very close to the United States. There's this investment in, a battery plant, things that apparently all the U.S. leaders want, in a red state like Georgia that is run by Republicans. And yet and still we have this massive ICE raid, but then very quickly there's a deal that's made. I mean, what do you make of this? Because it feels like there's so many contradictory aspects to how it played out.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that again. Absolutely. I think just to kind of recap, given that this has been an extremely heavy news week, we've had many, many big things happening. The largest ever Department of Homeland Security single site enforcement operation took place last week in the town of Elabella, Georgia, where Hyundai, in partnership with LG, has for the last few years been building an electric vehicle battery plant. Now, this project is a multi-billion-dollar project. It was slated to be, I think, Georgia's largest ever single job-creating project. And on top of that, it's something that actually goes back to the Biden administration, because for a number of years, the U.S. has been pursuing policies that are intended through both carrot and stick, bring over industrial capacity from South Korea specifically to the U.S. And, this battery plant in Georgia was just one of those aspects. Now, just before this raid, we saw a meeting between Lee Jae-myung, the new president of South Korea, and President Trump at the White House, which, on the surface appeared to be very conciliatory. It seemed like, they were getting along famously. At least that was a takeaway from a lot of people. But one thing that was very noteworthy from that meeting was that there was no joint statement that was announced between the two governments. This was ostensibly a meeting to finalize the tariff deal that, the two governments have been negotiating for the past several months now. And while we know that South Korea has already decided that it will put up $350 billion of state-backed investments into U.S. industry, what we don't know is how exactly those funds will be allocated and dispersed. The Trump administration has said that, they would like the power for the president to be able to personally decide those allocations. Of course, that is, I think, quite alarming to the South Koreans. They're not necessarily making that public, but I think the longevity and the long time that these negotiations are taking is certainly an indication of things. Now, getting back more specifically into this raid, I have to say this has caused quite an amount of alarm back in South Korea. The footage and the photos of this raid are being circulated widely by media. And we're seeing this very rare moment, actually, where both liberal and conservative outlets and political parties are coming out in denunciation of the Trump administration. So there are many people who are wondering if this could be the start of a sea change in South Korean politics and position towards the U.S.
And, to expand on that a bit, you've written a lot about before how there's a very unequal nature to the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea. And I'm curious how you would place this incident in that sort of broader imperial relationship between these two countries.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think on the U.S. side of things, the tariff negotiations tend to be discussed as if they are just kind of another jobs package or like another bilateral arrangement between nations. The tariff deals that the Trump administration is signing with other governments are very, very bizarre. Because what they are essentially asking, or demanding rather, is that foreign governments put up hundreds of billions of dollars, often from their own public purse or connected to their public purse through state-run institutions, and then invest that into the US, which, is pitched to the US public as a job creation program. But I think a better way to understand it is that this is kind of a version of the congressional bailouts of Wall Street that we saw in the wake of 2008, only this time it's being financed by taxpayers and citizens around the globe instead of simply by the US public. And so South Korea in particular has been asked to put up this $350 billion package. In addition to that, there were $150 billion additional dollars that were put up by private corporations. There was a separate $100 billion purchase deal for US liquid natural gas. That's already $600 billion from South Korea, which has an annual GDP of something like 1.7 trillion. So we're talking about a third of South Korea's annual GDP, which is being transferred more or less from the pockets of its working people into the pockets of Wall Street. There's really no other way to put it. This is robbery. I think that, that's really one aspect of the conversation that is really missing from the US side of these things. And I think it explains why, there is so much animosity building in South Korea, because, while there are attempts to pass this off as, successful diplomacy or an opportunity to create investments for the country, I think it is widely understood that this is a fundamentally unequal deal, and that, it's working people that are going to pay the price for this, both in terms of the long-term economic impacts that it has in terms of South Korea's place in the global market, and also just through the loss of, frankly, political sovereignty that is happening, as a result of these deals. And I think what's very interesting to note is that even the right wing, even the business community is beginning to pick up on this. In the wake of the Hyundai raid, I was very surprised to see an editorial from the Korea Economic Daily, which is South Korea's largest business paper. And they said, and I quote, "If the US attempts to leverage this incident in trade negotiations, it would be a betrayal of the trust of the alliance." I think that's very, very strong language. It's frankly, I believe, unprecedented language that we're starting to see from even South Korean conservatives. So politically, this is a very interesting moment. And I think that, some of the concerns being raised in South Korea ought to be taken up within the US as well. We have, these are not fringe outlets. These are mainstream voices that more or less represent, entrepreneurs, the capitalists of South Korea. And, they're openly questioning whether or not this had something to do with the Trump administration's desire to gain leverage in its negotiations with South Korea.
No, I think that's a critically important point, and it's notable. And I also want to note that I think there was one person who chose not to return and is actually pursuing legal action against the Trump administration, I think, for what's going on. But it just brings me to sort of another factor of all of this is I feel that, as much as sort of the issue of immigration and detention centers and others have been, in the news, that because of the sort of particular nature of this, the pictures that you said that I think are causing, a lot of correct consternation in South Korea of people being chained and shackled and all these things. It's also brought that a little bit more out in the United States, I think, in this context. And, obviously, I think the demonization of all immigrants is its own problem. But I think for so many people, it's like, wow, like these people were absolutely like not doing anything wrong, like in the sort of popular perception. And here's how they're still being treated. And I thought the sort of racism of the detention system and the, potential little look we saw into the detention conditions because of this was in and of itself a very revealing moment.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think, this has been quite shocking domestically in the US as well. Of course, there are a lot of people that are against these ICE raids. And I think, previous polling has indicated that even amongst people who prior to the election were in support of increased immigration enforcement, now are changing their tune because they actually have to deal with the consequences and look at the footage of, what happens when families are split apart. But I think, this is also a bit of a watershed moment. It marks a little bit of a qualitative change because this is, no longer just a matter of, the US, conducting so-called domestic enforcement. ICE is now being used as a tool to essentially target and change the relationships with foreign governments. And I think that's territory that we have not really entered before. And I think it'll be interesting over the next few weeks and months to see how other countries and, of course, other South Korean businesses respond, because I think the immediate question that will be raised to investors is, well, if I'm going to put up billions of dollars to invest in a project in the US, how do I know that ICE will not just arrest everyone or even myself, particularly given the fact that in this particular case, it has been reported that there were executives of LG Corporation that were swept up in this raid, right? So that's typically not who you see targeted by these ICE raids. And that's not to say that, there are, some people that deserve to be targeted by ICE raids and others that do not. But I think that noting that change is important politically because it helps us understand how certain actors in the future may change their tune or their orientation, not only towards this administration, but quite possibly to the relationship with the US overall.
Yeah, it is really stunning to see an ICE raid like this being used as a part of like economic trade negotiations in like a very mafia-like fashion. But I do want to ask, how is, I know the Korean American community is not a monolith, but how are Korean Americans maybe responding to this, especially those with maybe connections to labor or anti-imperialist movements?
Well, I think, a lot of progressive organizations have mobilized in the wake of this. There's been a number of efforts by the Nakasek Coalition, for instance, to, ensure the proper treatment, not only of these South Korean nationals, but also the more than 100 Latino workers who were swept up in this raid as well. And from what I've seen in local efforts in Georgia, this actually has been a moment where, different communities and different organizations are able to come together in pursuit of common justice. And, hopefully that is something that will last and that, continues to build into some kind of like sustained, organization, because I do think that is that's sorely needed. I think, amongst Korean Americans, from what I've seen and heard, this is a widespread topic of conversation in the way that it is in South Korea, and I think that a lot of people who may have previously believed erroneously, of course, that, this mass deportation crackdown would not affect them are starting to realize that actually, no one really is safe. And I think that, others who have been a little bit more hip to things, a little more in the know are, hopefully, and I think rightfully taking this as an opportunity to bring more people in and to, try to enhance the kind of political coalitions that could be possible. So, as we always say, organizing is the solution in the face of, the kind of unrepentant terror of the ruling class. And I think that this is a moment where, we have an opportunity to bring more people in, to bring more folks into alliance who previously have not worked together. And I'm just hoping that, everyone who is operating around this issue from many different parts of the political spectrum realize the importance of unity in this time, and that, that can be realized in the coming months and years.
Mm-hmm. And, to the point that you have been raising about sort of the geopolitical realities of this, I mean, it's interesting to see this in juxtaposition to what we saw, just last week, vis-a-vis when we're talking about the two Koreas. I mean, you have Kim Jong-un, who is there with President Xi and President Putin at this large, and many other presidents, I think 32 all told, commemoration there in China around the 80th anniversary of the end of the war on fascism. And, the whole world is sort of marking like, this looks a little bit more like the future in some ways, and the shift in the world and the things that are happening. And then, here you are having South Korea, which has been doubling down on its relationship with the United States. And here your so-called ally is just humiliating you and abusing your citizens. I mean, it just felt like an interesting juxtaposition vis-a-vis sort of where the world is going and what kind of geopolitical alliances seem more stable than others.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very pertinent point. I think that the fact that these events happened in the same week is incredibly telling. And, I think in many ways, South Korea seems to have missed an opportunity. There was a representative of the government that was present, but Lee Jae-myung, the head of state himself, was not present, in Beijing. And so I think that, I think there will probably be a recalculation that will happen in the coming months. And I think that we're in a very interesting moment because we even have people attacking Lee Jae-myung from the right at this point, saying that, he needs to take a firmer stance towards the US, that, they can't allow for South Korean companies or workers to be pushed around in this way. And I think that, inevitably what will probably need to result is that, South Korea will need to diversify and strengthen a lot of its foreign relations, which, Lee Jae-myung has indicated some openness to doing in the past. And now I think the question is, will he follow through on those things? Will he seize the opportunity to potentially, give South Korea a little bit more of a neutral position in the region, politically at least, in a way that, could actually result in greater opportunities and greater independence in the long run for the Korean people?
I just want to throw out there, too, that obviously this isn't as dramatic and theatrical and I guess as like horrifying to actual people as the ICE raid was. But it was just reported a bit before we started recording that Mexico will be raising tariffs on Chinese, I think, cars by like 50%, but Asian countries more generally, and one of the other top countries hit is South Korea to try. That's all under U.S. pressure, and also to try to like appease the U.S. in their own trade talks. But it is interesting to see how like even in these other countries that do want to do trade with the rest of the world, particularly with the Asian market, that the U.S. is enforcing these pressures not just against China, but also against its own allies in terms of a country like Mexico, which is a really big market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very interesting. I actually had not heard of that up until now, but I know that
just happened. Yeah.
Oh, it just happened. Okay. Yeah. I know a lot of Korean automakers are, very, very active in Mexico in terms of production. And so, my assumption would be that if the US is applying that kind of pressure on Mexico, part of what they're trying to achieve is also to ensure US dominance in auto manufacturing, so that, even if the company is not, doesn't have a US brand technically, that, if they're building everything in the US and they need to do that in order to access markets in Latin America overall, or in Mexico specifically, that's just another kind of feather in the cap of the Trump administration in terms of its ability to apply pressure on these companies. And I think, this will take a long time to work itself out. There will be a lot of competing interests at play. But I think fundamentally, what people need to wake up and realize is that the US is not playing for mutual prosperity. The US is playing basically a form of economic vampirism, right? They're trying to just suck out all the production capacity from, these countries that it previously exported production to, and what will be left of economies like South Korea at the end of that process. I think those are very, very important questions that should be asked by the political classes, by the organized workers, not just in South Korea, but across the global South, because of course, Korea is not the only country facing these kinds of threats.
No, that's absolutely right. Well, there's a lot to follow here and a lot to continue watching, and we will continue to follow it and watch it.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。